feel like I should apologize preemptively in case my two cats do anything crazy. They're- they've been they've been put in another room, but that might not stop them. So
We will look forward to the possibility. I should say also I'm home alone with my two dogs who I think have all their needs taken care of upstairs, but you never know. There might be howling as well.
I should apologize for child, a dog, and being like 2 years pregnant. So I might need to run to the bathroom 7 times, but I ask for your forbearance. But
I guess I'll say one more time just for people filtering in. We'll wait just another 1 minute or so and get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Nathan Goldman. I'm the managing editor of Jewish Currents, and I'm so excited to be moderating the second event in the Politics of Literary Practice, which is a series exploring the relationship between literary form and social meaning. Our conversation today is about criticism and creative form. In an interview from this year, the critic Kamran Javadizadeh cites the critic R.P. Blackmer's claim that the essence of poetry is that it, quote, adds to the stock of available reality. Javadizadeh says, yes, it's true that a critic, quote, might help a reader see how a poem has added to the stock of available reality, but a critic's writing can also enlarge reality. I appreciate the way this reading frames criticism, which is sometimes regarded as parasitic and aloof, as instead creative and engaged with readers and with the wider world. Indeed, criticism, understood as writing about literature, art, and other cultural objects, can be a way not only of thinking about such texts, but as thinking with them, and thus drawing readers into new relations, with the texts, with themselves, with each other, and with the world. But if criticism is a site of social possibility, it's also subject to political constraints, from the material conditions under which it's produced to the ways its forms inherently entail fraught questions of power. I'm thrilled to be here today with 3 critics, Sarah Chahaya, Zoe Samudzi, and Parul Sehgal, who think deeply about the relationships between art, criticism, and power, and whose work has enriched my sense of what criticism can do. Sarah Chahaya is the co-author of the Ferrante Letters, An Experiment in Collective Criticism, and the author of the forthcoming Bibliophobia. She's also a senior editor at the Los Angeles Review of Books. Zoe Samudzi is a sociologist, art writer, and contributing writer for Jewish Currents. Parul Sehgal is a staff writer at The New Yorker. Previously, she was a book critic at The New York Times, where she also worked as a senior editor and columnist, and she has won awards from the New York Press Club and the National Book Critics Circle for her criticism. If time permits, we'll close out tonight's discussion with some questions from the audience. So everyone out there, please share all your questions for the panelists in the QA box, and hopefully we'll have time to get to a bunch of them. So thank you all for being here. I want to start with a question about the critic's authority. So I think it's common for criticism to speak often in pronouncements and in absolutes, saying, for instance, that something is the best of its kind, and that these pronouncements may rest on a certain posture of universal authority or even a kind of assumption of omniscience. But various kinds of critical work, from contextualization to citation to close reading or speaking in the first person, can establish different kinds of authority. So I'm curious what you all think, how you think about your relationship to authority as a critic. Are there times in your work where you've encountered authority as a problem or as an opportunity? Or do you see there being, are there other ways of being with texts that sidestep that question of authority altogether?
I mean, I can start by just briefly saying that I feel very uncomfortable thinking of myself as a critic, as an authority. And I think that that relates, or it comes from the fact that I have always been a teacher. I've been a teacher longer than I have been a critic, I guess. And the longer I teach, the less authoritative I feel. I hope that none of my students are in the audience, but yeah, I am increasingly uncomfortable, and I think especially as someone who has been in the academic world as well as the non-academic world of criticism, I really sort of balk at the notion that my whatever I write about a book or even say in class about a book might be considered authoritative. I'd rather always be inviting others to push back or converse.
Yeah, I'm with Sarah on this. I don't really think of, I'm allergic to authority, which makes parenting and teaching hard, but my own authority, the authority of the child I submit to. But no, it's not how I like to proceed. I think that, it's not how I like to proceed, but it would also be naive for me to say that one does not have that authority writing for particular institutions. Your work is going to land in a particular way. Your work is going to have consequences, and regardless of the institution, your work has consequences for the writer who reads it, so it's a difficult thing. And I think that I'm very attracted to critics and criticism that both can hold that fact, but can also be sly, can undo itself in little ways. And I think that all the critics I love the most, and the kind of criticism I try to write, is thick with questions, so wants to pronounce, wants to speak forcefully. The job of the critic is also to be honest with the reader and to level with the reader. But you can also not traffic in easy certainties. You can describe your own impressions, and you can share your take, but you can also question yourself and to say, well, what does this mean? Why am I attracted to this? Or why am I repelled by this? Or what constitutes flaw? And I don't think this is heady. I think this is a way that a lot of critics actually increasingly do think about how to make that space also more interesting and energetic than just thumbs up or thumbs down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea of curiosity over a kind of absolutism is really important. And I think there's an impulse that I often see of critics to kind of be this voice from afar, this kind of disaffected, dismembered voice from nowhere, that somehow has an omniscient sense of the cultural field. But there's also a kind of pseudo humility in the assertion of an authority. And I think that I'm trying to describe something, but I don't want to say names because I don't want to get super shady. But I think there are some people that I've read that I do not like reading exactly because I can tell that their work is to try to form an extended canon. And I think that to me is the kind of least inspired criticism, because what is the point of encountering a work and simply attempting analogy and simply attempting to make a claim of how this work, not to say doesn't relate to another work, but is like another work, as opposed to thinking about how to put things into dialogue, how to put context into conversation with one another. I think the idea of being an authority makes me really anxious as an anarchist who I don't care for it. And I think that's just not an especially interesting space to write from. And I say this also as someone who doesn't do criticism kind of in an academic way, but is a sociologist. And the least good sociological writing that I see is this kind of dismembered expertise from nowhere, making a totalizing claim about something on a kind of flimsy or uninspired or uninteresting or really kind of antiquated political sociological premise. So I would definitely agree.
Yeah, I think just to piggyback on what you just said, Zoe, I think that, in addition to how irritated I often get with these moves that are like sort of analogical or trying to, as you said, make an extended canon, I think that the urge to say that, this thing that I'm writing about is as important as this other thing is not a productive move necessarily, and is like, it comes from a place of like sort of defensiveness that is I think not always generative or helpful.
Do you all feel like, I mean, that's all, I think, a super rich way to begin by sort of undermining the very concept or necessity of authority. I'm curious, as a kind of follow-up to that, how you all feel in the activity of doing criticism. Does sort of a disinterest in that kind of authority and an interest rather in other kind of bases from which to speak from, does that feel like in some ways a difficult move to make? Does it feel like it is defying something about the form, or that is commonly understood in the form, or does it not feel that way at all? Does it feel sort of easy? There's a million other avenues with a million critics working in interesting modes in that way. So I'm just sort of interested in the question of what of starting from that principle and doing the criticism, sort of how that, I don't know how that just feels, if that question makes sense.
Well, I can't speak in generalities. I can speak for how I do it and how I try to do it and how I think about it. And I think it's also important to think and remember that there's so many different kinds of criticism, and there's so many different kinds of critics, and there's so many different places that you can write criticism. And at least for me, it influences how I write and what I write, where I'm writing and my sense of who the reader is. And I think that coming up in criticism, writing for newspapers and magazines and having a really tangible sense of the reader and of making something for the reader. I don't think of criticism generally in abstractions. I think about making something for another person. It feels handmade to me. And it means something that I'm making for somebody who probably won't read the book. We know this. Those of us who work on the review sides of things know and have some sense of how these things work together. But you're making something for someone who might only read this review. And how do you make something that can stand alongside it? You want to, if you're recommending the book or whatever, to entice them to it, but it should stand on its own. It should have a certain kind of sturdiness. It should have its own kind of aesthetic experience. And if that's the case, there's so many other things and desires you serve and are interested in. There's the work of pure description itself, which is a huge part of criticism. There's the work of contextualization. There's the work of, especially when you're writing sort of non-academic criticism, there's the work of criticism as a kind of performance in itself. There's the work of creating its own sort of trajectory, its own sense of surprise. The work of language. So I mean, it's really endless, the kinds of things that become important and feel necessary when you're making a piece of criticism that feel as absorbing and as important. And from that, I do think that from that can come a certain kind of authority that I think maybe all of us would feel comfortable thinking about, which is the authority of your own commitment, the work you've put in, your style, your all of these things, which has a certain kind of presence on the page, which has a certain kind of energy for the reader that says, believe me, or maybe not even believe me. I don't know if I'm as interested in believe me as enjoy me, So that's something that feels very real and important, I think.
I think that I love what you just said. I especially love thinking of it as handmade, which I think is also how I think about it. Like I will often think about it sort of like a letter or like something that I'm sending to, you know, maybe not a particular reader, sometimes a particular reader, but a particular kind of reader, maybe, well, like an implied reader, to use the sort of reader response term. And I think in addition to believe me, what I think of most often is like, follow me, right? Follow me on this reading, like follow me on this path. And that again, I think is related to teaching and, you know, leading whoever you're with, whoever you're speaking to or writing to, on a path through a text that, you know, you don't want there to be missing steps and you want them to feel entertained and excited the whole way.
I really like the framing of follow me as well, because I think that as much as possible, if I'm writing about something that I've enjoyed, the other part of it is a very different set of experiences. It's like I'm trying as much as possible to communicate to an audience the kind of generosity that I have consumed and that I've enjoyed from whomever has created the piece. So there's a kind of care to it. I also really love this idea of it being like a handmade letter, right? There's a kind of like, I was going to try to make a math analogy, but I don't like math, but it's like trying to convey something, change it a little bit, and then like re-communicate it. I'm sure there's like a word for this that I'm just really losing. But it's like there's a kind of love being shared, a kind of community that's being built even just through an experience of having encountered something that you are trying to share and you are trying to communicate to others. And so as much as possible, especially sometimes when writing becomes a slog, I just like try to really remember and hold on to that.
Well, I want to take off from that. I think it's all really helpful to think about, you know, I think that the analogy to the handmade and to the letter is really instructive. And I mean, as it happens, you know, Sarah, you were the co-author of a book that really practiced this in a very explicit form as a formal conceit in terms of an epistolary collective criticism. And so I wanted to read a line from the introduction to that book, the Ferrante Letters, where you and the other authors describe this kind of polyphonic method as bringing out a quality that's inherent to criticism. You write, quote, "It is unnerving to have other people's voices clamoring in your head, but we believe that this would make visible the slow, fractured, and creative accretion of ideas that underwrites all acts of criticism." And so this is talking about like literally writing letters back and forth about the Ferrante novels. And that articulation, I think, gets at something that I really love about criticism, which is the way it's a form that makes explicit and brings to a fine point something I think is often true in other kinds of thinking, which is that the critic's thinking is a thinking with and often against others, that there's this whole kind of implied community between the text and the reader and the reader of the criticism and all these things. So, you know, thinking about that, I wonder what are the particular kinds of thinking that you think that dialogic quality of criticism makes possible? Or I wonder, are there instances in your own practice of criticism or as readers of criticism where you feel like you felt your thinking pushed, opened up in ways that feel kind of particular to that very specific mode?
Well, I can specifically speak to the Ferrante book and to the fact that it emerged out of a kind of necessity. I started that project and we wrote that book in a moment where I think all of us, there were four of us, myself, Merve, Emre, Jill Richards, and Catherine Hill, who wrote this book together. And for various reasons, we were all kind of feeling very, I don't know, like I think kind of like bankrupt in some ways, creatively, and, you know, like at the end of grad school or at the beginning of other things, like there was a real sense that I felt, at least personally, in starting the project, that I needed to be in dialogue to be able to write anything. And it was at a point in my career where I was under a lot of pressure from my institution to generate something and just produce. But for lots of personal sort of, personal reasons, mental health reasons, et cetera, I felt that I needed to be in a community to be able to create anything. And so the book came out of that impulse. And I think ever since that project, I've continued to think about it as a necessity for my writing. So even when I'm just writing something on my own, whether it is the kind of imaginary making something by hand for someone, or whether it's more likely I'm speaking to someone as I'm writing a piece, I always need there to be a sense that there's a conversation, and that no piece that I've written is totally alone.
I really relate and appreciate that. I mean, you really highlighted kind of the richness of like being in community over the often kind of fetish of like romantic isolation as a writer, which now that I've like been in a very unromantic isolation I'm like super adamant just is not real, does not exist. And so kind of at its best, criticism for me feels like the kind of active formation and creation of connective tissue rather than trying to think of things in analogy with one another or just in comparison to one another. Like what are the kind of arterial flow between and amongst, as opposed to in contrast to.
I agree. And I loved your book, Sarah. And it made me deeply envious. And I wish I could review every book like that with a group of interlocutors to push back at me and make me think and help me sharpen my own thinking. I mean, I've had experiences of like that informally with other critics at various places, but it's something that I think is, even when you're alone, you have that to some degree, and I remember thinking this when I reviewed Sheila Heti's new novel, and I found your review, Nathan, which was just like, voice in the wilderness. And I remember thinking about your review and talking to you as I was writing this thing, being like, I see it, and I see what you were seeing in this book, and I see it too, and I see what this writer is doing, and you feel like, at least I feel like, I'm speaking to the reader. You feel like you're speaking to, and disagreeing with people that have, misread your writer in ways that you find grievous and all of that. So yeah, there is always this feeling of a certain kind of dialogue happening, but there's also part of me that wants to speak up for what it means to write criticism alone and the vulnerability of it, and to actually say, this is what I think, this is what I have made, this is what I have done with the best of my ability, with the best use of my time, with my sense, and the bravery of that. And I think that that's something that is also easy to overlook sometimes. And to write a kind of criticism that also, when you read it, it has that kind of aloneness to it, and that sort of that strength to it also, that this is not something that has been created to please people necessarily. It may, but something that has been created because this is actually what somebody going to the sort of brink of their imagination and time and capacity has come up with, and I think that that's something that can also feel rare when I think that it's also a world where people can crowdsource when they're working on things. You put out a prompt, hey, I'm writing this, give me your examples, and then you write this piece. And I think that there's something very, when I see this happen, I'm both sort of like amazed by it. I'm like, oh, this is interesting, and it's collaborative, and you have people helping you with it, and then you're writing it. But there's also something in me that does love the sort of, or feels, tender and admiring of something coming out of one person's effort, and one person sort of standing by it, for better or for worse. It's your name, it's your byline. So I think that I wanted to speak up for the sort of loneliness and alienation of doing it on your own, as we all do inevitably. So why not?
No, of course, it's true. We are all we are all alone at the end. And I think that I I agree. I really admire that kind of embrace of loneliness. And I think that that's, in all of our, like, hopefully, knock on wood, long careers as writers, everyone will have these sort of ebbs and flows of, like, when you do things in community and when you do things alone. And I think that, yeah, I admire everything you just said, and I hope that I get there eventually. But I think it's very, hi Ariel. Yeah, I think it's very admirable, and I'm interested in the different sort of moments in people's careers. I think as writers, when you can see sometimes that someone's really at the height of their powers, and able to just sort of write something and do it with this kind of, like, proud aloneness. And there are times when you can see that they're very clearly in dialogue with someone else.
Yeah, I think that puts a finger on a really important tension. I wanted to ask about, this is maybe kind of, I think this actually involves this question of kind of dialogue on the one hand and standing alone, or the critic's individual journey or consciousness on the other. But I think it was Parl who invoked at one point, and Zoe also, questions kind of tied to questions of canon and the work of canon building, which is connected obviously to that earlier question about authority. And so I kind of wanted to ask a question about criticism and canons. And I was thinking about it in these terms, sort of involving the question of the institutions in which critics' work happens. And so I think, criticism often occurs in the context of and supported by institutions where there are processes of canonization that are unfolding, which shape the flow of resources, including attention. And while critics are not on their own, I think, invested with the power of canonizing, even if, as Zoe alluded to, I think it can be a critical mode sometimes for some critics to try to sort of project that willfulness of doing that. But even if the work of canonization is a social process, it's not something that one person does. The work of the critic does, I think, likewise involve a certain distribution of attention and determination of value that can be part of those processes. And so I wonder how you think about your role as a critic and the role of criticism in relation to that project.
Briefly, with mischief, I think, sometimes. So, especially if you work in these institutions and there's a sense of, these are the kinds of books we cover and this is how we cover them. If you can, and it's not always easy, but it's lovely to sort of stretch and push against it and to try to shift it, and try to say, why should this be so? I'm going to insist on doing this. It's not easy, but I think that when I've thought about what it means to be in a place that does have, I'm trying to find a less loaded word than agenda, but agenda will have to do. Agenda is as good a word as any. But you work in these places that have certain agendas and certain tastes and certain aesthetics. And I think that if you come in and you can, and to sort of chip away and smuggle in other things, other stories, other books, and get turned down and get people will say no, and why are you doing this? And you persist, or why am I saying you? I have tried to persist. I've tried to sort of find ways to sort of, in my own capacity, stretch it, change it. And this is not only what gets covered, but how. What's the sort of language that we're using to talk about these books? How are they being reviewed? So yeah, I think that that's something that one is in the jaws of these sorts of processes, and trying to sort of, at least in my case, trying to subvert it, stretch it, and think about what it means, and not trying to pretend that the critic doesn't have that power. These places don't have that power, but being cognizant.
I think for me, it's a bit complicated. Like, I think the kinds, maybe this part of what this responsibility has to do with is kind of the platforms that you're doing criticism for and kind of writing for. And I think that I've been grateful to not be in a position where I've been super concerned about like how far a particular commentary is going to go, if that makes sense. And I think that, you know, I'm really engaged with and kind of constantly thinking about glissant on opacity, even as I'm trying to kind of communicate ideas to people and maybe explain something or clarify or build out something that a creator is trying to make. And for me, I'm always sitting in this kind of tension between wanting to contextualize and spotlight while also wanting to permit, to like allow and ensure that there remains a kind of important opacity of trying to like support bringing something into a kind of different world, a different readership, while also not grasping and not trying to kind of unfold all of someone's secrets or all of someone's something. I don't know. I don't think I'm explaining this very well, but I'm always kind of sitting with this of trying to think about what did I feel? Where is this coming from? How is this situated? While also wanting to preserve a kind of privacy. And so I think the part of that is why I'm kind of often really canon averse and do as best as I can to stay away from anything that would suggest like trying to affix something really solidly and really rigidly into a particular tradition. Because I don't know how. Yeah, I don't feel like that's my place to kind of say.
Well, so I, for the time being, live in a place that is a very canon making, I guess, kind of institution in an English department. And I teach a class, I teach a sort of intro fiction, like intro to the novel lecture, which you could say is a canon making whatever, not by choice necessarily, but I think that I also try to do a version of what you have both said. Parl, the mischievousness, I think is a really interesting and good way to think about how to treat the canon as a critic and or the idea of, you know, the canon as a critic, as a teacher. And Zoe, I really like what you said about not grasping or like not trying to, you know, like force things into this imaginary, you know, set of whatever text that we're all supposed to know. I think that I would add to that a kind of like perversity. Like I will just not talk about it in my intro novel class. I'll just sort of give them, you know, a set of texts that, you know, maybe are like personally canonical to me and do form a kind of novel history from the 18th century to the present. But I will just choose not to engage with the sort of conventional mode of these are the important texts you're supposed to read. And I think for the most part, it has been, I mean, it has been fun and interesting for me to teach the class that way and to think about, you know, an introduction to the study of English literature in that way. I do occasionally, because I teach at Princeton, get students who are like, well, you know, what about this and this and this, and why didn't we do this in these ways? And I was told that blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I think that the perversity of just going in and being like, I'm just going to do it this way, and you can take it or leave it. You will tell me in your evals at the end of the semester. Yeah, I think it's, you know, the only way to to sort of live within these institutions is to do it like that.
I love the idea of having your own canon, and this is a comment more as a reader of criticism than as a writer of it, but every critic does have their own canon. And I think when you love a certain critic or you love a certain writer, part of the great fun is in reading them over several years to say, oh, this is your canon. These are the books that make you, these are your coordinates, you know? And yeah, this is just something that we can all spot in the readers and sorry, in the writers, that we love that idea of their own canons, their own stories.
I think, yeah. Oh, sorry, we're going to say something, Zoe? No, okay. Yeah, I wanted to just add to that another sort of piece from this idea of, the way that thinking of the personal canon can itself be a kind of work around or work within the work of canonization. Just made me think of a bit from another piece of the Ferrante letters, actually, that Sarah wrote, in this piece that was also kind of published standalone in the New York Review of Books, that's sort of thinking about formative texts. And so I just wanted to add this into the mix. In Sarah's sort of thinking about formative texts alongside formative relationships. She writes, but for me to write a piece of living interpretation, to share in gutsy, real conversation with a piece of art, is always to invoke form as a verb, not just to submit to the noun of its existence, a forming that is process-oriented, but not simply procedural, and to somehow animate that constant movement in words. And then a little later in this piece, you write, to have an adult relationship with a text or a friend, we have to first work within their constraints and then eventually work against them. It's in that pushback, the move away from the formative thing, that we actually learn the most about ourselves. And so I just sort of wanted to add that into the mix because it felt very resonant to me. And it's not exactly a question, though I guess in the form of a question, I would sort of ask if, how you think about in that work of, the personal canons and in series of kinds of interest and inquiries that every critic brings, how you think about that as both as something to bring to the table in some ways to maybe do some of this mischievous work within institutions, but also something, I don't know, do you see it that way as something that you're also sort of always self-reckoning with and working through, and how you think about that?
I feel like you've sort of outed me as a very argumentative friend. I think that, I won't speak for long about this because I think that most of what I think is in the passage you just read, but it feels very necessary to me to always be, both working within the forms that we receive, whether they are texts or other critics or other people in some ways and relationships, but also to be sort of pushing against those boundaries, and kind of testing yourself against them. I think that, the act of self-formation as a writer and as a reader has to do as much with sort of following the text that you're attached to or that you're wanting to get close to, but also to sort of defining yourself against it and thinking about, what it can teach you about what you are, but also what you are not.
I feel like in thinking about a personal canon, and I was just talking to some folks last night about this, and they were asking about how do you know when you found your voice? And I was like, I don't know. I don't think I've found it. And yet there are other folks who were like, oh, I started reading this thing and I really, really loved it. And then of course I realized it was you. And I was like, oh, I really appreciate that you think that there's something that is kind of distinct, because there are, a handful of writers that, I have a friend actually who makes fun of me for consistently reading and quoting these 4 particular writers at him. And he has informally banned them. And they're kind of my own intrapersonal interlocutors, as well as folks who are also a kind of stylistic and ethical orientation for me. So I completely lost my train of thought, but I think, the personal canon, right? So I think that in approaching something, I always kind of go back to a handful or a couple of them and kind of think about not where would they start, but it's based on the kind of values that I've built out from reading them, where does it make sense for me to start? And how does it make sense for me to kind of proceed? And I think that, having that canon over capital C canon is incredibly, much, much, much more important.
Yeah, it reminds me of something Fred Moten says about you don't need to worry about having a voice. You can have a sound, and the sound is thinking with with your lowercase c canon. It is your time. It is all of these things coming together, you know, which I think is powerful. I want to come back to something that Zoe said. I don't know if it sort of ties into this, or this is, you know, an awkward segue, but if you want to permit it, because I think that this is something I think about a lot, and I don't have any answers, but this idea of, I mean, we chatted a little bit about this when we emailed before the panel, but this idea of preserving something in the text, right? Like, how do you interpret, but also respect and create space for something? I think you use the word privacy, right? But some spirit in it, right? So you're not just tying the text to a chair or sort of scooping out its rinds, or, you know, whatever, insert own terrible metaphor. But how do you do that? Because I think some of it does come down to the venue, right? So if you're writing for a newspaper, you have to have that nut graph saying, why am I writing? Why am I reviewing this book? Why now? Why does it matter? Insert a few adjectives letting me know its importance and stature. And why should I bother? Why are you bothering? But I think you can still figure out ways, even in that form, to approach and think about and circle something within the text. But I'm curious, I just want to hear from Sarah, and maybe even you, Nathan, and maybe more from Zoe, about how, you know, approaches to that. How do you find ways to sort of signal that, I mean, I want to use the word essence, but that isn't right. But wherever you're finding that quality that you want to note, you want to flag, but you don't want to interpret to death. You don't want to speak for, if I'm making sense. But
yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. You don't want to tie the text up to the chair. You don't want the text to be your hostage. And I think that, you know, as I was listening to you speak, I was thinking about how some review essays that I find myself not sort of wanting to follow necessarily, or wanting to be with, are ones that don't, in which the dialogue is not with the text, right? The dialogue might be with someone else, or the dialogue might be with the reader, sometimes in a mean-spirited way against the text. But I think that, you know, it is part of our job to always remember that the first other person, or the first other thing or entity in criticism, is the text that you're looking at, right? And so, you know, we've been talking about the kind of internal dialogues we have, or ones with other critics, or ones with our implied readers. But I think that this is a really important reminder that always the first interlocutor is the text itself, right? And I think that can exhibit itself in various ways. Like, I think that I am like an incorrigible sort of imitator of things. And so if I'm writing about a text that I really like, I will find myself kind of working in its idiom in a way. And then that's something that maybe I will like try and not do, or just go with. But yeah, I think that there are so many ways that we all kind of show, right? And to use the word that Zoe used, like generously and also kind of privately, right? It's the relationship you have with the text, and you show some of that in the work that you do. I don't know, Nathan, what do you think?
I think this is a really hard question, and I'll probably mostly evade it and try to just give some more language to even press the question further. I do think it's something that I wrestle with as a critic, and also as someone who, part of my job is editing a lot of criticism, and in thinking with critics in that way, with a sort of tension even in that role. I think that is similar to the writer's role, but then also even, I don't know if it's even more so, but it puts a finer point on some of the tensions, because I always sort of have to ask myself if I'm, when I'm part of a editorial group assigning things and working with critics I want to work with, and trying to say like, well, why this piece and why for us can put some of those demands. And we're, and at Jewish Currents, we like to publish criticism that tends to sort of make strong arguments and interventions, which I think there's a lot of, there's a lot to say positively for that, and I would defend about that, but they can also feel in tension sometimes with the kinds of work criticism can do to circle kinds of mysteries or preserve textures and stuff. I don't think those things are inherently irreconcilable, or that we don't also publish criticism that does the other thing as well. But I think it invokes those tensions. And I guess I'd want to, if I've successfully evaded the question, well, I just want to add a little to say that, I mean, this is something I worry over a lot, and just to maybe introduce some language from a text that sort of I found like very both provocative and that I argue with a lot in my head. I find both very helpful and often find myself agreeing with, and then find myself really not agreeing with, which I think speaks to this kind of exact question that Zoe invoked and Pearl kind of helped extend. And so when it's the Susan Sontag essay Against Interpretation, which from 1964, and so this essay, she argues that interpreting art is not universally valuable, but is, she writes, quote, must itself be evaluated within a historical view of human consciousness. And she writes that interpretation is in some eras, quote, a liberating act, but that in her own era, when she's writing this in the 60s, quote, the project is largely reactionary, stifling. And she goes on, I'll read a little bit more of her, and says, quote, to interpret is to impoverish, to deplete the world. And then the sort of famous last line of the essay is when she says, in place of a hermeneutics, so an interpretation, we need an erotics of art. And so I don't know if that helps put it even for a finer point on this tension, because she is such a provocatively, a heightened way of arguing it. But it makes me wonder with her, if interpretation is a primary mode of criticism, how do we think about the sort of possibilities of interpretation that even in the essay she lays out, even though it's literally titled Against Interpretation, she does speak to as having a kind of liberatory potential, but sort of so how do we think about the tension between interpretation that can abet or generate a sense of possibility with art versus that which can constrain it? And I'm also, something I've always sort of wondered over since reading this essay, that I wonder if if it sparks anything for all of you, is the way in which she makes it a historical argument. And so I always wonder how, if you agree with her that there are historical or political contextual reasons or factors to how interpretation works in those ways.
I mean, I don't know how much she agreed with her, to be frank. I mean, this is Sontag who probably went and unraveled that argument, not like 2 years later, right? And then made it again and then unraveled it. So I don't know. I mean, I think with everything, it's a question of how. You can have interpretation that is absolutely stifling, and you can have interpretation that feels nourishing and generative and gives you more vocabularies, heightens your senses, sharpens your perceptions, gives you more tools to think with, shows new paths that a novel or a story or a piece of work can go, and another one that feels like it just, closes them down. So I don't know. I think I'm dodging in fine Goldman fashion, but I think that's my hunch, is that so much comes down to how you do it and why you do it. And we can all tell. You can smell it. It comes off the criticism. We can tell when a piece of criticism is intent on making something new, and an attempted criticism is somebody enjoying scolding or closing something off. We know this. So I feel like maybe I feel like I also feel like I'm simplifying your question really crudely, but my initial response is that it comes down to the execution. It comes down to the intent, and that leaders are sophisticated enough to sort of to feel that and to understand that.
I agree that it is, you can tell when an interpretive move is closure, right, as opposed to an opening or an invitation or a provocation. I think that it is a provocative claim that she's making, and I'm thinking about the historical aspect of it, which I have sort of thought about on and off before. But these questions about, of course it is historical, everything is historical, but the questions about what interpretation does or can do are perennial, right, in the history of interpretation, broadly speaking, and now are, have been happening again on the kind of scholarly side under the guise of like critique and post-critique, and we just always have new terms or versions of it. But I think that there are always multiple kinds of interpretation available or happening, right? In different, there are different sites of critique or interpretation. And I think that to echo what Carl just said, like for every person who is doing something that Sontag would be against, there's someone who is not, right? There's someone who's doing something else. It just may not be in the particular sort of milieu that she's, that anyone who's sort of making these claims are looking at.
I don't have anything to add. I'm really chewing on the question and just trying to think about it. I'm just thinking about like what the comments are that Nathan gives me on my edits, and just thinking about like how I approach things. And I know that something that I often don't do is to like get into a lot of detail about what I'm reviewing or what I'm talking about, and to just kind of be like, this is a thing that exists. Let's talk about everything that exists around it, because my impulse is just to preserve and to leave it alone, and to be like, someone made this. I would like you to go read it, or I would like you to go engage it, because this is what it opens. And like, this is the kind of possibility that it permits. And I'm thinking about, speaking of someone who I think I quote into oblivion, Barthes, and thinking about like studium and punctum, like I try to avoid the latter. Like I try to stay away from the essence of the thing, and to try to put a finger on it, and to try to explain the attempt to put a finger on the thing, and to just be like, formally, this is what it's doing, and here is everything else that also does the thing. Because I don't know why. I feel like it's at some point I'm gonna have to stop that, and maybe I should train myself out of it, or maybe I shouldn't. I don't know. I haven't decided if it's a problem or not. But I just like to stay away from it. I don't need to be an interlocutor of that kind of intimacy, if that makes sense.
Just such a good argument for there being so many different kinds of critics, because I love that Zoe can do that and step away and say that it's enough to say that this is here. Now let's see all the reverberations and everything it's opening up. And at the same time, the work of the critic in coming as close to the object as possible, as close to the text, as close to the language, also is a really thrilling kind of drama and thrilling kind of texture that you get, and a kind of thought, and the kind of difficulty, and even just describing its effect, whether it's on the body, whatever your mode is, it's also so delicious and it feels important. And I think it's just, we need all these things. Zoe, don't do anything differently. We just need other people who enjoy this to do it more rigorously, and then you can continue doing exactly what you're doing. That's as your reader, those are my wishes. So
I definitely agree with that, as your reader, Zoe, and an editor of your work. I want to try to sneak in one more question really quickly, and we're going to run out of time, but if you'll be, just to try to sneak one last thing in. So one other thing I wanted to ask about is just the question sort of positive and negative criticism. Criticism is often understood under that binary, I think, and with, to choose a phrase that I think Zoe had introduced earlier, with praise framed as sort of generous and critique as ungenerous. But Parle, in her review of Sheila Heti's recent novel, which she referenced earlier, Pure Color, she troubles that kind of overdetermined association and writes, quote, "Criticism can itself be a form of intimacy, a capacity to value flaws as something like a wobble in a line, evidence of a human hand, of human striving. Sometimes we can see the reach only when the grasp fails." When I read that, it made me think of another line that I think kind of resonates with this, which is this interview in which the critic Hanif Abdurraqib said, quote, "Critique for me has to be an act of love, or else it's a waste of time." And so I was thinking about these things together, and then also to throw one other thing in, I was thinking about pieces like, especially like those of Zoe's. I was thinking, Zoe, of your kind of subtle pans, an earlier one of Jeremy O. Harris's Slave Play, and then more recently of George W. Bush's Book of Paintings, which are both these very critical pieces. And I was trying to think about love in relation to these. And I was thinking, are there cases where critique is an act of love, but the love is directed somewhere other than the text or than its author? And so I wanted to ask, just with the very few minutes we have left, what you all think about that. Are there instances in your work where you've performed critique that you think is grounded in love? And if so, where would you locate that love? And then just to add one other last layer of questions, bunk questions, I'm interested in, if critique can be as generous as praiseful criticism in some way. I wonder if that points to ways, beyond text and beyond criticism, of ways that we can be with each other in ways that are more honest and more generative.
I think that I would say that negative, I guess if we're going to kind of use this binary, negative criticism is always more weighty and kind of significant. I don't want to say insignificant, but it's just, there feels like there's more urgency than something that I loved. Because as much as it is easy for me to be like, I really loved this, you should read it, here's how I loved it, it's really important for me to also highlight the kinds of things that can do damage, and that desire not to protect so much as to kind of consider potential harm or harm caused. That does come from a place of care. And I actually just finished a piece about someone who made work that I think was like formally very interesting and conceptually really naive. And it was really hard to figure out where to draw the line. And my editor was even like, I can tell that you're like holding something back. Like, I need you to just say what it is that you needed to say. And I added another 150 words because it was like, the way that this work was existing in the world was just, there was a kind of impunity to it, right? There's a kind of way that it was untouchable, like President Bush in his weird rehabilitation, I love immigrants now, let's get into like a robust, humane immigration policy kind of grandfatherly statesman move that I think, because of the way that history has been functioning and the way that the subsequent Republican president was so much worse, like we just forgot. And sometimes, being a hater is fine. And I think in what both Sarah and Pearl were talking about with regards to intention, like it's very obvious when you have had to kind of bring the hammer down a little bit, because like you can tell when you're being a dick and when you're genuinely like really trying to iterate and reiterate something that is dangerous. And I think, readers are smart for the most part and they can tell. And I think that there are just some people who can't understand anything other than psycho fancy. And if it's not, I loved this, it was wonderful, it's this should be destroyed. And I think that you just can't pay attention to that. And you just have to be as kind of careful and honest as possible. And sometimes it means like tearing something apart because you have to, I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's so many overlapping circles and kinds of care that can not always happen in a negative review, but it's the care for, it's also a care for the writer to take the work seriously. It's so easy to write some of these reviews that we all see out there, clogging up the arteries of this sort of, the sort of mealy-mouthed stuff. But it's care for the writer to say, I'm gonna read this rigorously. I'm going to hold it and take this and pay attention to this and bring all that I am to bear upon it. I think it's care for the reader too. There are, especially those of us who review fiction, sometimes you have to stand between between publishing and the reader too, and sort of say that there's this hype, or this book is being created, this is being said, So I think that there's a little bit of a crisis of trust when it comes to criticism, and I think that the critic can be honest and can level with the reader in those particular ways. And there's also care for the form, there's care for what the novel can do, what it can be, their care for these approaches. So yes, it can be all of those things. And I think the distinction that Zoe makes is very important. We can see that. We can see when a review is being written in that spirit. And we can see that because there's evidence in the review, right? They'll quote, they'll show you. The critic will often say, here's a book where this happens, and it doesn't make these sorts of mistakes. We'll get a sense that the critic has read other books by that writer, that they've done their work, that they're not just coming out and sort of unnecessarily or cruelly, panning something. You have a sense that this is why it matters. There's also a sense of when a negative review is written, why that review, what does it serve to sort of pan a novel or book somebody may not have heard of, So these decisions to review it at all, you have to make a case. I think you have to make a case for it. Why am I singling out this particular book or this writer? Something meaningful, something larger must be extracted, at least for me. I think that it's fine to go and write a negative review of a more established writer, but if I'm going to go and pick apart something new, something from a first-time writer, there has to be something that's being illustrated beyond that. So these are some of the concerns and some of the possibilities. But no, I agree. I think that there's a real sense of responsibility that one can bring to the project, and a great sense of yeah. I mean, I think I could go on and on about this, but no, it is a service of its own, and difficult to do well, I think.
Yeah, I will just very briefly say that I think that I agree with everything you both said about how it is a kind of service to pay attention, right, to the serious, or to take seriously the project of whatever the thing is that you're looking at. And Zoe, I really admired your essay about the Crazy Bush paintings book, because you draw the reader's attention to what the book is asking of them, right? And what the book and that collection of paintings is asking of them is to sort of aestheticize and gloss over everything behind those weird sort of flat paintings, right? And so the attention that you're drawing to, not only, I mean, you do sort of give a descriptive reading of some of the paintings, which is quite hilarious, but you also, more importantly, ask the reader to consider what they might be taking on in reading and looking at the paintings and reading the book and considering it the way that it's being presented to them. And that, I think, is a really important and necessary aspect of critique, like just, critique, sort of big C critique, as well as small c critique.
Thank you all so much for this fantastic conversation, and thank you to everyone in the audience for being here with us. I'm sorry that we didn't end up having time for questions, but thank you for everyone who shared them. And yeah, it's really exciting to see everyone who's out there. I hope everyone who's able will join us for the last event in the Politics of Literary Practice series, which is called Translation, Migration, Mobilization. That'll be on April 13th. Moderated by my colleague Claire Schwartz, who will be speaking with Jennifer Croft, Mona Kareem, and John Keane about translation. That'll be really wonderful. In the meantime, if you don't, please subscribe to Jewish Currents to get our quarterly print magazine, and please follow Sarah, Zoe, and Parl's wonderful criticism. I hope you all have a great rest of your night, and thank you so much, and take care.